Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist depression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local community radio station. My name is Andy and I will be with you for the next hour. And today we're broadcasting on Jagera and Turrbal country, I should say. And today on the show we are going to be talking about deforestation, which unfortunately is still happening at quite a rate across this country, as it has been for the last 240 or so years since white settlement came and claimed this country as its own. One of the first things that we started doing was cutting down trees, and we haven't really stopped. And so we are going to be chatting a bit about it on the show today. I spoke with ecologist David Lindenmayer, who is also an author, and earlier this year he released a book called The Forest Wars, which talked about the effort to stop native timber harvesting from native forests, and the reason why that has been less successful than it maybe should have been for environmental reasons, the collusion between industry and government and all issues. The Forest Wars, it's a strong title, you know. War, it's not a word to be thrown around lightly, but David obviously sees this conflict as one where there's a lot at stake, and of course there is environmentally a lot at stake. And I'll also speak with Hannah Thomas, who is based at the University of Queensland and who has done a study into deforestation in Northern Australia. Of course, so much of the news over the years about native forests has focused in the southern states, where there's these beautiful old growth forests with giant trees, and where there's been big campaigns of people locking on to machinery and all that kind of stuff. But actually, Queensland has the highest rate of deforestation in Australia currently of any state, and one of the highest rates in the world actually. And mostly that is for agriculture, continuing, although of course the big rural projects, mostly of the mining industry and now somewhat of the renewable energy industry, also clear native vegetation. And so I talked to Hannah about why that is, what it looks like, and what we can do about it. It is a big issue, of course. It's far from us, most of us, you know, these forests where they're being knocked down, but it does affect us, of course, climate change being one of the main ways. And I'll tell you what, it's pretty hard to get any kind of meaningful climate action politically. We've learnt that over the last few decades of trying. And even when you do get some gains, often there's political changes and they get wiped out. And so one of the easiest forms of climate action is to just leave the good bits of our climate infrastructure that are already there, which is forests. They're the best carbon sinks, and they do the best job of offsetting the incredible amount of greenhouse gases that we generate as a society. And yet, the one thing that's helping us out, we're still cutting it down. And of course, the climate cost of deforestation is huge, particularly if you add in, as David Lindenmayer says, the increased fire risk from log forest, then that becomes its own kind of emissions problem if we are going to continue to have more and more bushfires. And so for climate reasons, certainly it is one great reason to stop deforestation. There are plenty of other reasons as well, about biodiversity, about water retention, and cleanliness of water. And, I think there's something kind of intrinsic about the importance of leaving some forest. And I think it comes down to a question of whether our species, the humans, are compatible with other species surviving on this planet, or if our existence means that every single other species has to fear for its own future and existence. And that's the kind of existential question that we should all ponder about what we want our impact on the rest of the world to be and the future. And so it's one thing to stop and think about. This place is habitat for all the other species. Can we leave it there and let them live, or do we have to clear it so we can have more farms, or so we can have a timber industry that mostly, the native timber industry in Australia mostly just gets pulped for paper and cardboard boxes for all the stuff that we buy. So anyway, that is what's coming up on the show. And also, before I go on, I should say that today's show, it's going to be fairly dry, I guess, talking to people who have studied in an academic way forest and the impact of deforestation, and talking about it on a pretty sort of conceptual level. But I do want to give a shout out to the people in New South Wales at Bulga State Forest near Elands, who have been out this month blockading with spirit. There's been 19 people arrested this month trying to stop that forest being clear-felled as part of an ongoing campaign to stop native forest logging in New South Wales. And so if you're interested in seeing that, you can look up Save Bulga Forest or the Northeast Forest Alliance to see what they're up to, and we'll probably talk to them at some point on the paradigm shift. But for today, we are going to be talking to some people who have studied in great detail deforestation, including David Lindenmayer.
My name's David Lindenmayer. I'm Professor of Forest Ecology and Management and Conservation Science at the ANU in Canberra.
As part of that job, I suppose you've also written a book called The Forest Wars, which came out earlier this year. Forests, we tend to think of them as nice, peaceful places, but you've pictured as a conflict zone in the title. I guess why have you called this book The Forest Wars?
Well, one of the first things that happens in any conflict is the first thing that's lost is truth. And in the Forest Wars case, what's happened is that the industry has been associated with massive disinformation for 40, 50 years. And I thought it was really important to point out the extent of the lies and deceit that's gone on in the industry for the last 40 or 50 years. So that's one of the reasons, was to arm people with the ability to push back against the bullshit that comes from the industry on a regular basis. The second thing was to be able to provide a new vision. What could the forest look like? How could it be managed? Why would it be important to make a change to the end of native forest logging and a plantation-only industry in Australia? How feasible is that? What does it look like in terms of employment? All of those kinds of things. And I think that's a really, really important part of the narrative here, is that there's actually a better way. We can manage forests for biodiversity, for carbon storage, for water production, for tourism, all of those kinds of things that produces more jobs, better jobs, longer lasting jobs than the industry that we have to prop up with massive subsidies at the moment.
I guess this is an interesting way of thinking for you, because, I mean, you are an ecologist by trade, and I guess you think about a forest in a certain way of an ecosystem of different species. Is it a bit of a leap to then be thinking about it in terms of a more social science or even economics perspective?
I work in a an environment that's multidisciplinary. I work with economists, with environmental accountants, with people from mental health, well-being, social sciences, those things, and I have done so for the last 33 years. And so it's really it was really a natural step to look at the forest not only through the lens of ecology and conservation, but also through the lenses of carbon storage, climate change, economics, environmental accounting, social change, those kinds of things. So really the book was built on not just ecological work, but all the other streams of work in which I've collaborated with a whole range of people with different skills over the last 35, nearly 40 years.
Let's talk about some of the disinformation, as you've called it, that the forestry industry has put out over the years that you felt you needed to counter with this book. I guess, what is that kind of disinformation?
Oh, there's many of them. Originally, the book started with 54 myths, and my publisher said, no, we have to have less than this. And eventually we compromised at 37. So, one of the myths is that we need to log forests to make houses. The reality is that the amount of native hardwood timber in a standard house has declined dramatically to the extent that it's now less than 1 cubic metre per house, way less. It's down about 10 times on what it was just 20 or 30 years ago. The reality is that the vast majority of sawn timber in a house, floorboards, roof trusses, furniture, actually comes from plantations. It doesn't come from native forests. And that the timber from native forests, the trees, are being used to make wood chips, paper pulp, box liners, packaging materials. That's what our native forest is being used for. About 90% of everything cut in a forest. And the reality is that we don't need native forests to produce those materials. We can readily do that from plantations. And so I think that's crucial for people to understand, is that just because we don't log native forests doesn't mean that we can't build houses. Of course we can, because we already have the products from plantations to do that.
Some of the others, I guess, are more environmental ones about, I guess, the regeneration of forest and its resilience to fires and rolling carbon storage, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the key things here is that there's a lot of people that are saying we have to log forests because that's needed to keep people safe from fires. The reality is that logging makes forests more prone to higher severity fire. In fact, a logged forest always burns more severely than an intact forest, and the effect is so substantial that a logged forest burning under moderate fire weather still burns at higher severity than an intact forest burning under extreme conditions. So I think it's really important that people understand that logging forests adds to fire risks, doesn't subtract from them. So that's one of the most important myths. If we're going to tackle some of our most serious fire issues, often the key will be to leave the forest alone and let it grow through to a less flammable older growth stage. So that's one of the most important myths. Another one is the myth that we need to cut forests down as part of tackling climate change, because we can turn wood into forest products, furniture and the like, and that means that in the end we store more carbon. The reality is that the most carbon dense environments are intact old growth forests, and when we log forests we generate huge amounts of emissions. So prior to 2024 2024 in Victoria, native forest logging in that state generated carbon emissions equivalent to about 730,000 motor vehicles every year. Tasmania, it's over 1 million. So these are non-trivial numbers, and we know that if we stop land clearing and native forest logging, we would reach about 50%, roughly half of our carbon emissions targets just by doing those two things alone.
And I guess we're used to the idea that our natural environment is expendable where there's money to be made. But the interesting thing about native forest logging is there's actually not that much money to be made, is there?
And I think most people would be stunned to learn that we actually don't make any money from logging native forests. It's a highly, highly subsidised industry to the extent that native forest logging agencies in every state make a loss. The only place where there is actually a profit in forestry is from the plantation sector. And sometimes the losses are astronomical. So in Tasmania, the losses from Sustainable Timber Tasmania and its predecessor, Forestry Tasmania, exceed $1.3 billion. You know, the Tasmanians could easily have built a stadium for its new football team and populated its hospitals with doctors and nurses very straightforwardly if it hadn't wasted so much money on its native forest logging. Similarly, in New South Wales, huge subsidies. In Victoria, over $1 billion were handed out to the industry. Vic Forests, when it existed, lost in its last 2 years $269 million. Will never pay back another loan of $80 million. So these are the kinds of numbers that characterise the industry right across Australia. So I think it's really important for people to understand that the taxpayer is paying for the quote-unquote privilege of having their forests cut down.
Can I just ask one question about that data, I guess? Because, yeah, all these forestry industries, they run at a loss, but I guess they are just cutting down and selling the logs. And from a government point of view, the extra bits in it, like the wood chipping company, the paper pulp company, the timber mill, whatever, are they counted in that like there's money made later down the chain? I guess that's just a question about the data.
No, most of those organisations essentially can't exist unless they're essentially having access to almost free wood. And what is happening is that the cost of cutting down the forest and putting it back again far exceeds any return on that investment to the taxpayer. So the only way that the industry will work is through massive subsidies. And so that is essentially taking money away from other parts of the economy, whether it's hospitals, whether it's schools, whether it's aged care facilities, or any other list of things that you could think of in this space. So, but the other side of this is that there's also a cost to the environment. And that is, for example, when you log a forest and regenerate it, there's significantly less water. And water production is really important as the lifeblood of every city. And so that's by logging forests that are our water catchments, we're actually taking water away from really important public service, which is providing water to support people. In Victoria, logging of their water catchments is equivalent to taking out 650,000 people's water. That's a city the size of Geelong. So there are also significant carbon emissions that come with logging forests, which contributes to climate change, which is also a really significant issue for communities and costs communities lots, as we've seen with fires, with floods. We're all dealing with the problems of extreme weather events associated with climate change. So the industry itself costs the taxpayer a lot of money, but then there are other additional costs on top of that in terms of its impacts on water, climate change, fire risks. You know, the problems of the Black Summer fires were estimated to be in the realm of $100 billion. And we know that logging native forests makes forests more prone to high severity fires. So these are the additional costs on top of the losses that are made.
And I guess the other side of it is that a forest is something that is not just a resource that could make money for some people, that a forest has its own worth. What to you is the worth of the forest?
Well, forests are clearly very important for biodiversity, for water production, for carbon storage, but they're also very important for recreation. And we know that people's access to natural areas is crucial for their physical health and their mental health. But also forests that are intact can be very important parts of the environmental and economic fabric of many parts of regional Australia. And we've seen the comprehensive changes to many regional economies when they move away from native forest logging, which employs very few people, towards nature-based kinds of activities, whether it be mountain biking, whether it's tourist infrastructure like aerial walkways, or long-distance walking, or other kinds of opportunities for people to engage with forests. You know, the economics data is comprehensive on this, whether it's in southwest WA around Walpole, that part of the world, or the Tarhoon Walkway in Tasmania, or the Otway Ranges in Victoria. These outcomes are clear and demonstrable, and employs more people in better jobs, better paying jobs, longer lasting jobs than in the timber industry.
So I guess part of the question, and this one's not an ecology question, it's maybe a political ecology question, is, well, how is it that the logging industry, which is quite small, as you've said, how did it manage to get such outsized political influence that it can keep running at a loss and keep having this government support?
It survives because of its lobbying power. Okay, so it survives because there's a major union, the CFMEU, which is a huge donor to the ALP, so it has enormous influence there. It survives because there are industry lobby groups like the Australian Forest and Forest Products Association that also has strong links. It survives because there's an armada of public servants whose jobs are associated with maintaining the industry, and in some cases there are more people regulating the industry than there actually are in the industry itself. And finally, it survives because there's a professional body, the Institute of Foresters, now called Forestry Australia, which will do everything in its power to continue to protect the native forest logging industry, even though it's not ecologically sustainable, it's not financially sustainable, it's not sustainable in terms of wood supply because the forest is largely overcut in most parts of eastern, southeastern, southwestern Australia.
I'm interested in translating this to Queensland, and we will be speaking with Hannah Thomas actually about Queensland land clearing. But in Queensland there's not really a timber industry, and yet we have very high rates of land clearing. I guess, how do you think your research kind of translates to our part of the country?
Yeah, so I've got relatives in Queensland, and through my father's and mother's side, and there was a lot of land ownership that went with the past generations in the Lindenmayer family. And the reality is that in many cases there's been extensive land clearing in Queensland, sometimes first of all associated with logging, and then with burning, and then grazing, and then repeated cycles of that. And part of your Forestry Act in Queensland permits that kind of continuous and successive sequence of disturbances that really degrades forests quite badly over time. So I think there are certainly significant issues with the relatively small but nevertheless quite damaging native forest logging industry in Queensland. You know, the data for logging industries in Queensland are much worse than they are in the rest of Australia, and so it's very hard to get a decent picture of it. But based on what we know in the rest of Australia, it's highly likely that where logging takes place is also very important for biodiversity. So there's a big clash between areas that are suitable for logging but areas that are also suitable for many threatened species. So that's one of the key issues. The second thing is that Queensland does have extensive areas of plantations, and they're very important. And really the financially viable and functional part of the forest industry in Queensland is really the plantation sector, pretty much as it is virtually everywhere else in Australia. And that is that where the money is, where the jobs are, where the best management is actually in plantations. And really that's the future of forestry in Australia, is plantations. But we have to manage those plantations well. We have to protect them from fire because they are flammable, just like logged and regenerated native forests. But there are ways of managing them well. And the other thing that's really crazy in an Australian context is that over 90% of our plantation eucalypt pulp logs actually get exported overseas. That's really daft. It's just like the gas problem where we're exporting gas and then we have to import it from elsewhere. It's a no-brainer that we need to have a wood reserve so that a proportion of the timber that's grown in Australia is processed in Australia for Australian jobs.
Yeah, and this is an interesting side, I guess, because industries often complain about greenies. They just want to shut everything down, and they're sort of out of touch with what it requires to run a society. But you're very pro plantations, and environmentally it would make sense for us to build much more stuff out of wood than we currently do. It's the most sustainable building material. Is there a place for a green argument to say we should have more timber harvesting, more plantations, more logging, more mills, more building out of wood?
I think there is, as long as the wood is derived from plantations. I think the true value in our native forests is for storing carbon, generating water, providing tourism jobs, recreation jobs, conserving biodiversity. That's where the real value is in the native forest sector. The real value in plantations is producing wood products. And I think you need to put this into the context of what's happening with fire regimes throughout Eastern Australia. So what we know is that there's a significant increase in the frequency of fire, and there are many areas that are now burning so frequently that it's not possible to grow the trees old enough to be able to grow saw logs. So in parts of southeastern Australia, fire frequency is so high that there's a less than 20% chance that trees will survive long enough without being burnt to get to a saw log age, which is about 80 years. But we know from plantations, if they're well managed, you get a timber crop, a thinnings after 14 or 15 years, another one after 20 years, a clear fell at 25, you re-establish the forest. So you essentially get 9 cuts over a 75 to 80 year period in the same time that you get 1 cut from a native forest. So really, the bottom line is plantations well managed produce timber much more quickly, they're much less fire prone. We can produce much more timber off a much, much smaller area. The outcome and trajectory here is really quite clear. And I think the lesson from places like New Zealand, which exited native forest logging over 22 years ago, was that once you exited native forest logging, you end up with significantly more investment in the plantation sector, because there's a disincentive to invest when the wood coming from native forests is essentially rent-free. So the people that are cutting it down are basically paying nothing. It's really the taxpayer that's propping it up and giving the native forest logging industry an unfair advantage relative to the plantation sector.
Well, in the last couple of years, 2 states that had significant logging industries, Victoria and Western Australia, have both stopped native forest logging. Do you think that the future is looking up for our forests?
It is looking up as long as it's real. So the reality in Victoria is that the government has said that it's exiting native forest logging, but in fact native forest logging is a zombie logging industry in that state. They do things like putting in massive fire breaks, even though there's no evidence to suggest that they work. That will potentially lead to 25,000 hectares of forest being logged and deforested because they won't grow the timber back. There's also this ridiculous idea that we need to do post-disturbance logging, so that's called salvage logging after wildfires and after windstorms. That has an enormous impact, very detrimental to the forest. And then there's this other crazy thing called forest gardening, where forestry has renamed logging as forest gardening, and they're doing logging on First Nations country, using heavy machinery, using Western industrial forestry practices in the name of supposedly healing country, except that it destroys country. So there's at least 3 kinds of logging that is taking place under the guise of a different name, and we have to clean up that mess. We have to stop that kind of bastardry to truly exit native forest logging, both in Western Australia and in Victoria. These are important things to be aware of, because essentially that kind of logging is going on only to keep the industry ticking over until there's a change of government in places like Victoria, because the coalition has indicated that it wants to bring back native forest logging.
Well, your book does end with an alternative vision for what forests in this country could look like and our relationship to them. Do you want to share that with us?
The vision is that we stop native forest logging, that we convert areas to national parks, that we invest in those national parks through things like green bonds. That investment leads to forest recovery, forest replanting, forest regeneration. It leads to control of feral animals like deer populations who are exploding everywhere. It leads to weed control. It leads to better fire management. it leads to First Nations people working on country, and it leads to tourism infrastructure being put in place to give more people more access to forests for their physical and mental health. And it means that we start to reduce the massive losses that go with native forest logging, and it's something that should take about 2 years maximum to do, given the employment churn in the industry, to take us to a better place.
Well, thanks very much, David, for chatting with us today. If people wanted to find out more, how could they find your book?
The book's available everywhere. It's published by Allen and Unwin. It's called The Forest Wars, and it's available through all good bookshops. For example, Avid Reader in West End, but many other bookshops across Queensland and elsewhere.
All right. Thanks very much, David.
It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Here on the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ, we're speaking with David Lindenmayer, who has written the book The Forest Wars and has spent many decades studying Australian native forests, and also, I guess, it seems like studying the politics of why these forests are continually being logged despite everything, the environmental costs and the financial cost of it. What he didn't talk much about was the current rates of deforestation in Queensland, which are extremely high. And there's been, shuffling around Queensland land clearing legislation over the last decade or so. It gets changed a bit, and then there's protests from farmers, and then it gets adjusted. I don't think there'll be much move to protect our native forests under the recently elected government that we will have for the next few years. But it'll be up to us to make sure that the pressure is on them if there is going to be any environmental protection from a government that has not made it one of their priorities, that's for sure. And so to start off with, maybe we should hear from people who are studying what's going on in our state with our native forests and the rapid loss of them. So I spoke to Hannah Thomas to hear about it. Let's have a listen.
My name is Hannah Thomas, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland, and I'm looking at deforestation policy in Northern Australia for my PhD.
Yes, we are talking about deforestation today on the Paradigm Shift, and interestingly, I guess over the years, a lot of the high-profile campaigns against deforestation have happened in the more southern states, in the southwest of Western Australia, in Victoria, Tasmania, currently in New South Wales. But Queensland, despite the fact there hasn't been such a high-profile campaign, actually has higher rates of deforestation than any of the other states, I believe. Can you tell us a bit about what is the deforestation happening in Queensland?
Yeah, so you're definitely correct. The focus has been on the more southern states, and that's because a lot of these states cleared more of their vegetation earlier. So Queensland still had a lot of forests, say in the 1980s and the 1990s, when a lot of clearing had already happened in, say, South Australia and Western Australia. But now, as you point out, Queensland has the highest rate of deforestation of any jurisdiction in Australia. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for this. So things like mining, urban development, agriculture, even projects for renewable energy development. But the largest proportion is for agriculture and primarily for establishing pasture for livestock grazing.
So in practice, this is a bit different from in other states where it's often a state-owned logging company clearing state-owned state forest. Whereas in Queensland, it's more often, if it's for agriculture, it's more often private actors on private land. Legislatively, it's going to have to be a different approach to tackle the very high rates of deforestation here.
Yeah, so in Queensland, we have what's called the Queensland Vegetation Management Framework, and that regulates clearing on private land. And that can be quite a controversial piece of legislation. We often see amendments to that legislation, and it provides a lot of uncertainty for landholders. So what we recommend as part of the research that we've been doing is to develop better stewardship schemes and incentive payments so that private landowners are actually being paid to retain that forest rather than being regulated to clear it or to not clear it.
Yeah, you have recently done a study, as you said, about deforestation in Northern Australia. Can you tell us a bit more about what findings came out of that study?
Yeah, sure. So that was a big study to look at large clearing events that had happened across Northern Australia between 2014 and 2020. So we only focused on clearing events that were bigger than 20 hectares. And we actually had about 18,000 to go through, and we examined for every single clearing event which policy was relevant and whether that clearing event had been regulated by that policy. So we found a couple of different things, but one of our key findings is that our national conservation law in Australia, so this is not Queensland state law, but our Commonwealth law, is not working effectively to prevent land clearing or clearing of threatened species habitat.
Yeah, and I guess mentioning threatened species habitat brings up an important question, because some people would say that, well, this deforestation is necessary, for big projects like mines or agriculture or something like that. But I guess as part of your study, what did you find are the effects of deforestation on our natural environment in Northern Australia?
Yeah, there's a big impact on the environment. So habitat loss is one of the biggest factors affecting threatened species in Australia, but it's also affecting the environment that benefits us. So trees keep the soil healthy, they reduce the impact of flooding, they provide us with clean air and clean water, and they regulate the local climate and rainfall as well. So trees are really important. And like you point out, in some cases we need these projects to go ahead, whether they're for renewable energy or mining, but often there's actually land that's already been cleared in the past that would be a much better alternative for these developments to be situated. So we call for much better what's called spatial planning, which is where you work out where these developments can go that minimise the impact to biodiversity.
So that's one outcome that came out of the study. The other one that you mentioned is trying to pay stewardship costs to farmers. I guess what other things can be done to stop the rapid deforestation of Queensland?
Yeah, so stewardship schemes would ideally be publicly funded by the government, but a big thing that's being talked about at the moment is, and you might have heard of it, called the nature repair market, which has been introduced by our Commonwealth government, or any sort of market-based scheme to provide payments. So this is where payments actually come from philanthropists or business rather than being funded by the government. So things like carbon markets and biodiversity markets. Now, although these are promising ideas, because in some cases businesses do want to pay for benefits to biodiversity and to forests, it's also a bit more risky because we can't quite predict how much money is going to come through these sources and whether they'll be used in the correct way and how easy it is to measure their benefit as well.
Were there any other findings? Obviously, the legislation that's in place, the Environmental and Protection and Biodiversity Act and things like that, are these effective tools at making sure that our environment is being looked after?
Yes, so that's a really important point. Like you mentioned, the EPBC Act, what we call. So since 2022, there's been announcements to reform that act because at the moment it's not effective and we want to see quite a lot of changes to make it more effective. But unfortunately, a lot of those amendments have been delayed recently. Very few of them have gone through, or the ones that have gone through may not be the most effective. So there's definitely lots of things with our national law that could be done. For example, an independent environmental protection authority to improve kind of compliance and enforcement. And then we also want to see what's called national environmental standards implemented as part of this act. So what that basically means is a standard is upheld for every impact to the environment that has to result in a positive outcome. So for example, any impact to threatened species would actually have to result in a higher population of threatened species. So some of these changes could make a lot of benefits, but we really need to see them actually implemented into the law.
And what about for the average person who cares about maintaining some of our natural environments and our forests in Queensland? What should the average person be doing to try to help our forests out?
So one of the easiest things you can do is to use your vote wisely and tell your members of parliament, whether that's federal, state or local government, how much you value trees and forests and how important they are for you, to make sure that our politicians who are making decisions about these laws understand that the community really cares about forests and woodlands and would like to see decreased deforestation rates.
Okay, thanks, Hannah.
Thanks so much for having a chat.
You are on 4ZZZ. We were speaking with Hannah Thomas about deforestation in Queensland and its unfortunate high incidence. Of course, around the country, there remains a lot of native forest being cleared, and there are a lot of work to do to try to protect it for all kinds of reasons, for the species that live there and for us as well. Trees are very vital for our own survival, of course, are about the drawdown of carbon out of the atmosphere, producing oxygen. They produce rainfall with transpiration. They retain water in the soil. They stop soil erosion, and they allow for nutrients to build up in the soil. And so for all kinds of reasons, it is in our interest to protect those forests. We're lucky in Brisbane, actually, we have these beautiful little patches of forest within our suburbs as well. Even close in around like Whites Hill and Toohey Forest on the south side, and around there's an opportunity to go and see some nature in our city, and of course habitat for all kinds of animals, including koalas in those forests. And so we're very blessed to have that. Not all cities have it, but we've got to protect that, as well as the expanses of native forest which are currently being cleared. We are just about out of time on the Paradigm Shift. See you next week.